Bonjour à tous. That's all my French, I'm afraid. Not much French. I do speak quite quickly, so if I'm speaking too fast to understand at all, please just shout, wave your arms. If you want to ask anything as I go through the talk, please ask. There'll be time at the end for questions. I will try to catch up on the time a little bit. What I want to talk about today is really about our experiences of taking a new startup company and making it very agile and very dependent and based on Scrum. And what I'm going to talk about a lot actually is, I think, is about people. So for us, for our business, which I will talk about, it's really all about the people we have working for us, so that every day they come into work and are excited to do what they do and can do great things. And that there's some real principles and values that we've tried to establish in our games development studio that underlie everything we do, so that whatever processes we use, whether it's Scrum, and we're not so good at Scrum as we should be. Things break and it's difficult, but there are principles underneath it all that means that things keep working. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about games development. I think, do we have some people from games here? Do we have some Ubisoft? Oh, hello. Maybe we talk later. A bit about the company and how we use Scrum. But really, as I say, I really want to talk about just our experiences. I'm going to share some stuff, some things that we do, some things you might think, don't really understand that. Maybe we can talk about it. I'll just give you a bit of a flavour of what we do and how we do it. Some things we've tried, some stuff that perhaps doesn't work quite so well. And just hopefully some interesting things that will allow us to have a conversation at some point. Sorry, that's a little bit small. So just a little bit about me. I kind of have two parts to my career. The first half was in some very large organizations, manufacturing, banking, very waterfall, very process-driven, lots and lots of, I have to be very careful in this building, I guess, but lots of Microsoft project schedule, fantastic, and all these things too. And a lot of sort of process improvement initiatives, Six Sigma, all these kind of things. And then in 2003, I had the opportunity to join Electronic Arts, a very big games development company based near London. And when I joined it, I didn't realize at the time, but it was a very Scrum-like environment. It wasn't Scrum. People didn't really know what to call things, but it was kind of like it. And I sort of discovered Scrum, actually in a very strange way, through somebody who came in to be interviewed for a job as a project manager. And he was talking about Scrum. And for me, suddenly I realized this person had words for all the things that we were doing. Oh, over here in the light, sorry, in the light. Had words for everything that we were doing. So I took Mike Cohn's class in 2006. Was at EA for quite a long period of time, running some pretty large teams there using Scrum and Agile, teams of up to about 150 people, pretty big and complicated developments. And then left to start up a new games company just over 2 years ago in London, and that's where I've been ever since. But anyway, this is kind of the real me. Forget all that boring stuff. This is kind of how I grew up. I don't know about you guys. Do you recognise any of this stuff? Maybe? Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, what a time to grow up. I mean, this is nearly 30 years ago now, but what an exciting time. So for me, I always kind of wanted to do games development, really exciting. I was a programmer a long time ago, a very bad programmer, which is why I didn't stay doing it for too long. But here's a bit about the games business. It is entertainment, and it's still very driven by reviews, ratings, scores, and certainly up until fairly recently, and even now, still has a very hit product mentality. It's about a blockbuster hit. Although the last point there says squeezed middle, meaning that actually increasingly the market seems to be becoming about big blockbuster products on the one hand, very small quick developments on the other. So mobile applications, Android, iPhone, those kind of things. And it's quite hard in the middle ground to make products that are still expensive but are struggling to recover their money. So hopefully through this you'll see some pictures of kind of how all the pictures are from our studio. But developing games it's a very creative, organic process. It's very hard to write down all the requirements before you start. And coming from a very large American bank when I joined Electronic Arts, I found this very hard initially to understand. I couldn't understand whether this was just a very different environment or whether people were just being quite lazy and couldn't define what they wanted up front. So it took me about a year or two, really, to realize it just is quite organic for us. We try stuff, it works, it doesn't work, and then we keep moving forward. It's very suited to Agile and Scrum. We have a lot of different disciplines. It's not just engineering. I'll show you some team stuff in a minute, but a fairly small proportion of the team are actually programmers. There's a lot of other people there that need to work together. So talking to each other all the time is really important. And for us, it's all about the software. It's all about what you can play. So I think you'll see from that, Agile and Scrum kind of suit us very well. So just very briefly, we've been going for 2.5 years. We have about 70 people now. We started with 1, which was me. Now we have 70. We released 3 titles last year in September, 2 on PlayStation, 1 on PC, and we're working on a whole load of stuff this year as well. So that's kind of us. Our projects, just for a bit of background here, this isn't typical of all the games industry, but for us, our projects are about 1 to 1.5 year long. It's about how long the projects are. We do have 3 definite phases, which may sound a little waterfall, but it is kind of how we break things up. The first stage, pre-production, is very much about what is the game we're making. So it's not defining detailed requirements, but it's trying to understand what this difficult, complex thing we're about to make is really all about, who it's for, kind of what it's going to look like, all these kind of things. And as I say, we still target really boxed product retail games at the moment. So here's a quick idea of team size for us. So far our teams have been about 20 people, 25. They're getting bigger at the moment as we do some more ambitious projects. We have some much smaller ones of maybe 4 or 5 people. But that's kind of the makeup of the teams. So on a team of 20, we would expect maybe 6 to 8 people will be software engineers. At least a quarter, maybe 1/3, will be artists. So people making art, animation. We have some sound people, designers, and a lot of very specialized people buried in there. So not just all artists aren't just artists. We have some very, very specialized people in there as well. So Scrum, for us, I'm not going to talk too much about Scrum today, but some of it, it's kind of the basics, really. We found for us 2-week sprints kind of works pretty well. We've tried 1, we've tried 3, even 4. 2 weeks works very well for us. Any shorter, and the team don't really feel they can deliver enough work. Any longer, and we're kind of leaving things too long before we see the progress. We do shorten those sprints towards the end of our projects. We found that as we get towards key deadlines or big milestones, that going down to 1 week works very well. And in fact, even going down to daily, almost. It's very hard to imagine a daily sprint, but that's kind of what we do at the end for the last couple of weeks. I'll talk about product ownership in a minute. I saw on the board a minute ago the difficulty of finding a good product owner. We struggle with this too. And we don't have a single product owner for our games. It's quite a complicated setup for us. And partly because of this, it's entertainment for games. Everybody is a consumer, has an opinion. We work with a publisher who is Sony for us. And Sony have opinions and views on the priorities, the business value for the product and the features. So do the team, so do the senior people in the studio. So it's very hard for us to pin this down. So we don't have a single product owner. We have groups generally who perform that function. Everything for us is physical planning. We don't use any software apart from a bit of Excel to do some high-level planning. Everything is on boards, on cards, Post-its. The whole project's run like that. And we shipped all 3 games last year solely using those methods. And they did ship on time because they were timed for release of some new hardware, so they had to come out on a particular date. They had to be released on day and date with new hardware for Sony. And they hit those dates, and that was our entire method. I won't go through everything else, you can kind of read it. It's all pretty standard. Perhaps one of the big things, I'm going to talk about some of these other things in a minute. And this is also pretty standard, really. It probably looks better on that slide than it is in reality, I think. It looks very tidy and neat. It's never quite this clean. But fundamentally, we do try and keep some form of backlog and agree the goals for the next 2 to 4 weeks. And then we're really engaging with each team, with each Scrum team, to say, here's where we think we need to be. And they plan their own sprints. They're very good at doing that without any prompting, really. We look through that plan. It's all on a board, physical board. The teams run the sprints. They meet daily. And then we have a sprint review at the end. All pretty standard, I would say. Here's some of the things we find hard. We find a lot of things hard. It's really difficult, this. It's a funny thing about Scrum and Agile. I don't think any one thing is particularly difficult. If you read up on any one thing, it seems quite easy. Do a daily meeting, have a backlog, and each one thing is quite easy. But doing them all well, all the time, is what I find is really difficult. You do one thing well and something else is broken. You fix that, this is broken. And constant energy to keep it running. So we find getting to a complete, prioritized and sized backlog that is up to date all the time, I won't say impossible, but very difficult. Things change so fast for us. That's a real challenge. Kind of keeping the process going, having enough rigor and discipline to keep it running is quite difficult. And it does seem to need constant input of energy from somebody, usually me, to try and keep things sort of moving along. Knowing what done means, I'm going to talk about in a minute, is very difficult for us for all sorts of reasons. Largely with a 12 to 18 month project and very iterative organic development, it's quite hard to know when we've finished and what good enough means. And we've adopted a strategy for that, which I will talk about. And as I say, this single point of product ownership is pretty difficult for us. But having said that, I was reflecting on the way over. Some things in our studio just happen. Like today, I'm not in the office, not in the studio, could be out for a week, and I know these things will keep on happening. People talk a lot. So in our studio, it's quite a noisy office environment. It's all open plan. People are out of their chairs talking to each other all day, which is, I know, will always happen. The software works almost all the time, most days. We do run continuous integration. The code and the data builds continuously all day, sending out messages. And partly because of that, but partly because of the cultural things that I'll talk about in a minute. People expect the software to work every day, and therefore it kind of does. People make it important. Our office is messy, definitely. But it's very alive. The walls they're all covered in stuff. Whether it's the backlogs, the sprint boards, lots of post-its all over everywhere. So it's messy, but it's very alive. And maybe that's something people running Scrum find is difficult sometimes with their management, that they're used to having a nice, tidy Excel sheet plan, and they come to an office where suddenly there's all this chaos everywhere. How can that be planning? But it certainly works very well for us. The daily meetings happen every day, and the teams plan their work themselves. So in the absence of meeting up properly to review what the goals are, I know that all of the teams will take it upon themselves at the start of each sprint to plan their work. They'll come and ask if they're not clear about goals, but they plan their work themselves. They'll get a Scrum board up and running, a sprint board, and they'll make sure their daily meetings happen every day. The other thing I find really interesting is that people from all different disciplines, both programming, we have virtually no, in fact I think I'm probably the only person who counts as a project manager in our business. Everybody talks about the process and how we can make it better, pretty much all the time, from the most technical software engineer to the most creative designer. There's a lot of talk about how we make things better, and people play the software all the time. So I'm pretty sure now if I put a webcam up in the office and could show you what was going on, I think you'd find all this stuff does just happen, despite those difficulties, and you'd see a lot of people playing the stuff that we're making today. So, that's a bit of a long introduction. The rest isn't quite so long. I'll be okay with time. So really that's a bit of background, and it got me thinking about, well, those things just happen anyway. Why do those things happen? And I think a lot of it, I do think it's about how we've gone about embedding a culture of what we do within the studio. So I don't know if this will work for everybody, and as I said at the start, all I will do is share the sort of things that we've done and the sort of things that seem to be important. So I think most of it is really, for me, around the environment you create, the culture, the way you organize stuff, of which the rest of the points are kind of sub-points, really, because a culture where rapid iteration, having things very open and public and physical, playing the software, all these things are part of a culture, but I'm going to talk about each of these points. And number 6, I think, also very important, is the fact that we talk about this stuff every day. Probably all of it every day, certainly most of it, most days. A very influential guy from the United States who did some training stuff with me had some fantastic sayings, and this is one of his phrases that's really stuck with me, that people make important what you pay attention to. So by paying attention to things, as managers, so for example, paying attention to the fact that the build needs to work every day, people make that important because you're paying it attention, you're expecting it to be there. So without even telling them it needs to be there, they make this stuff important. So having a language we can talk about, that people understand what you think is what you're paying attention to, that they can then make important is really important. So the other underlying theme for this actually is going back to the Agile Manifesto. I've been to many Scrum talks where we're talking about the process of Scrum and the mechanics of Scrum. I think it's really quite easy sometimes to lose sight of why we're doing Scrum. And a lot of stuff as to why we're doing Scrum is built on the foundations of that Agile Manifesto. And this whole thing about culture, organization, I think really comes down to this statement from that manifesto, that you build projects around motivated people, give them the support they need, and then trust them to do their jobs. Again, sounds kind of common sense, really, but it doesn't often happen. So here's some of the things that we did, or have done, or are doing to kind of support that. The first thing is, I had the luxury of coming into a company and being the first person in the company to stop and think about what sort of company do we want this to be. But maybe like you, I've also been in teams where I've taken on a team that kind of isn't working too well or has its own culture, and that needs to be changed. So I don't think the principle is really any different. It's a bit harder. So one of the first things we did was sit down as a senior group, once I had 2 or 3 more people employed, to think about what do we want our culture to be. So, create it deliberately rather than, as it says at the bottom, let one just form accidentally. Because if you don't do it deliberately, there will be a culture, there will be a way of working, so let's be deliberate about it. And these are the sort of values we talked about over 2 years ago now, that I think really still live with us. And we don't put these up around the walls. Some companies choose to do this. They have values and mission statements and all this stuff. We don't really do that. It's just a language we kind of use, particularly around the individual and the process stuff, I think, about expecting people to take ownership, show leadership, be flexible, think about goals, not about tasks, and being focused on software. All these kind of things are things we set out to try and make deliberately part of the language that we do use every day. I think a lot of it starts at the hiring the right people. Maybe that's pretty obvious. And I guess as I get a bit older, I start to feel more and more that hiring is here. It's what you feel about people. Are they going to be the right fit and do the right things? You can usually teach people skills, but finding people that get this kind of environment can be quite tough. Using this language all the time, and I'll point a little further down, very inclusive language. I'm really aware, I've come from some environments where the language is all about you, they, he. Usually, he didn't do it, I did my bit, and a lot of sort of kind of blame feeling of that kind of language. I take great care, and to coach my managers really, that the language is all about we. Why is it that we didn't deliver the goals from the sprint? What are we doing to improve the process? So being very inclusive, I think, is a massive thing for us. Emphasis on delivery as a team, as a studio, not as individuals. So again, what did we as a team, and I'll include myself in this team, whichever team it is, how are we doing? What can we do to improve? I had an interesting comment, actually, about 2 months ago from, it was actually one of the guys in that picture, commenting that maybe sometimes we don't recognise individual contribution quite enough in our studio, which I found quite interesting, because we do take a lot of effort to recognise teams, and here's a guy saying, but you know, I do so much work here, do I get recognised? And I don't have an answer to that, actually. Just it made me think a lot about maybe the balance, but I think it is predominantly about teams for us. The daily software reviews. So once we come out of the pre-production phase, certainly, and we're actually really making our game, we play the software that we're making every day, informally, in a room, just, you know, open door, senior people usually, anyone else invited, just to play what we have, see what's going on, get a bit of feedback, solicit opinion, you know, all those kind of things, and we take that pretty seriously. And that sort of regular communication to people, I think, very, very important. So one thing I do, which is very small, I guess, maybe most of you do similar things, is we still, every week, every Friday, we get the whole place together. We're small enough to do that still at 70 people, and just let people know what's going on, whether it's good or bad news, and just try and have that, keep that kind of communication going. And we encourage people to get up out of their chairs and talk. We have very, very low email traffic. Almost all of the email traffic in our studio consists of pictures of cats from the internet. There's very little work email traffic, because people know that the second that an email war starts, that I'll be out of my chair saying, just go and talk to the guy sitting next to you, rather than, you know, write endless emails. Most of the email traffic, being serious, is really with our external clients rather than internal. And then I guess for us, it's been thinking all the time about whether the organizational structure that we have is working for us. So I don't have a perfect answer to how to organize teams. I think they're all very different. What I do know, and this is a fantastic quote as well, I'm sorry I don't attribute it because I can't remember where it comes from, that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So you will, if you keep organizing as you are, you'll keep getting the results you get. So the main point in here for me is we keep reviewing and adapting as we go. And we stop and think about this as a sort of more senior team pretty regularly about how we're running ourselves. The way we do organize ourselves, though, that's stuck with us as principles is fairly light hierarchy, very, very few managers, which I'll talk about. We don't have particularly rigid job bandings. We have senior people and not senior people, but that's kind of it, really. And we expect flexibility of people right from the interview. So certainly in a lot of bigger games development teams I've seen, people end up doing very, very specialized roles, more like a production line. And what we expect is that people can do kind of pretty much anything they need to when they need to. They may not be the best person, but they may be the only person that can actually take that task on. So a lot of flexibility. And our Scrum Masters aren't professional Scrum Masters. They just emerge from within the teams. They tend to be designers, but they're also, many of the programmers do Scrum Master. So we don't hire anybody as a Scrum Master. In fact, we don't hire anybody as a manager at all in our teams. So at the studio level, our structure is pretty flat. There's myself and three senior guys, sort of directors effectively, who look after each of the disciplines. So the director of design manages all the designers, the senior and the not senior designers. Same for the art and technology. And the studio management team is those four plus our company MD. And in a studio of 70, we got to about 80 6 months ago. We don't hire any other managers. It all comes from the team. And then we sort of mirror that on the projects. They're quite similar. So we tend to have these roles on a project, somebody who's the most senior person for the artists, the designers, and the programmers. And if the project's big enough, we do put in place a single person who's responsible for kind of pulling all that together, usually a creative person rather than a manager. On a small project of 6 people, several of those roles will be done by the same person. So these aren't people or job titles, it's just a role that needs doing. So on a small team, the exec director, the design director, and the senior designer may well be one and the same person. So the second thing for us that's really important is rapid iteration. I wonder if you can guess what my fantastic sketch is. It's kind of how I imagined that this painting started, with a sketch like that. And this is kind of how we find it suits us very well to work. And it's about playing stuff, as early as we possibly can. I talk about playing. If you're writing non-game software or business software, I guess we'd be saying you want to be able to use the software as early as possible. Making mistakes quickly when the cost is low. And for me, it feels like, I don't have any empirical evidence, but it feels like quality comes from the number of iterations that we can go through rather than the amount of time we spend on something. So if we have 3 weeks to try and achieve something, I would far rather do 3, 4 iterations of that than try and get something finished in 3 weeks. It just feels better for us that we iterate as quickly as we can, which does mean, and it implies, working from very, very low fidelity all the way to high fidelity, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's also so fast, cheap, let's try and make mistakes quickly and early. The physical stuff works well, pictures, not words, they work very well for us, clearly in a very visual software environment. Some kind of practical or real pictures with real examples. So a couple of the titles we released in September were for, I don't know if I'm allowed to say Sony in this building, I guess I can, were for Sony's Move controller. It's like the Wii-like controller. When we started developing these games, there was no Move controller. There was just an idea. So this was the this was the first cardboard prototype that the senior technical guy made to try and show us what it might be like. The red ball on the end isn't completely for no purpose. It was actually tracked by the camera that we had on the PlayStation that allowed it at least to track a red object, even though we didn't know what the thing was going to be. So we built a lot of those to use for people for a while, which is kind of insane. And over here, I'll show you a video later of all the bricks on the table. One game we were building was all about building with blocks. And we found one of the best ways to explore building with blocks was to build with blocks, really. That's kind of what we did. And we got lots of people around it, all from different teams on the studio, and they spent an hour or two at a table trying to see what was fun about building stuff. Knocking it down. Was it about building the tallest tower? Was it about having a race with your neighbor? Was it about using as many blocks as you could? So a whole lot of stuff we did there. So I wanted to try and update some of these examples. Sorry, they are a little old, and they date from time at when I was at EA working on the Harry Potter franchise. This isn't so much about software fidelity, but it's certainly about the design and visual fidelity. So this is the very first design for one of the levels that went into a game. We had a fantastic designer who was great at mocking things up, and he liked starting off with Lego. It's kind of how he did, it's how he built the levels to explore the ideas. He was also a pretty good artist, so having done that, he was able to kind of turn this into, firstly, a pretty rough and ready sketch explaining where things were kind of going to be, and then a slightly better sketch. Before getting a bit of colour in there and a bit of feeling about here's what it's going to be. This is all, of course, before we've touched a line of code. And that's not to say that actually, I'll talk about that in a sec. There's that. And then that's kind of how, it's a bit dark, sorry, but that's how it actually became. So here's an example of this, of some block building, some sort of kind of physical prototyping. So we actually captured, there was a serious point to that. We weren't just taking videos for the fun of it. We captured a lot of video that day just to see what people kind of had fun with, really. Another visual thing we use a lot of is storyboards, very rough, ready. And I suppose you can think of these, I guess the convergence with some of the Scrum and Agile things are, these become sort of visual story cards often for people. This is kind of describing the feature or what we're trying to make, but in a very, very visual way and in a cheap and quick way without having to write 200-page design documents. We often resort to physical things like board games. So for a football game we were making, we actually figured out the rules to this just on paper using a board game. We had a laptop at one stage where we introduced some of the timing and the rules, but it was very much about just what's it like to play it before we even go near the code. And then also, I think you've seen some of that already, but establishing the look and feel of the stuff outside the software. It's very expensive for us to get good software looking to the right level of visual quality we want in software. That's difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. Whereas the artists are able to fairly quickly show how things might look. So sorry, I couldn't embed these in PowerPoint for some reason. But what I have is a couple of examples of just visual tests, really, and these have kind of become a specification for the artist. This was for a game that came out in September. It's just an animation test of how a robot might move, so all pretty simple. That's at the kind of fairly simple end of things. At the other end of things, sometimes, and one of the things that plagues us, actually, that I should have said is one of our other difficulties is, people that are paying us for the games we're making always want to see the game we're making before we've made it, which is really difficult, because they want to know what they're spending their money on and what they're getting. So we do sometimes resort to spending, in this case, 2 or 3 weeks, if I could get this to work. Oh dear. I think I've broken my laptop. What's that all about then? All right, I'm going to skip the. I'll skip that other test. I think I'll skip that other test. Just carry on with the presentation. Sorry about that. But often we will create something just as artists that show what the game's going to look like. So a couple of artists can usually create something that looks like we want the game to look, to show people how it might be, without us having to spend months and months of programmer time doing the same. So kind of where all that stuff leads me, really, is this thing about done. Done is difficult for us. I said that at the start. And I think the conclusion I've come to is that having a strategy for our iterations is very, very important for us. We don't get to done in terms of a potentially shippable increment within a sprint. It just doesn't happen for us. So we've had to define what done means. And the way we've done that is to talk about on this graph. On the one hand, we have the gameplay fidelity, so how well the function is, how well does it play, how good is the function, and on the other axis, how good does it look, how good does it sound, so the real visual and audio fidelity. And for us, it's about trying to push towards as high a functional fidelity as we possibly can before we commit to the very expensive stage of adding all the art and the audio. So we try and iterate as cheaply and quickly over here. And the line at the very bottom left there is really out of the game. That's where the board games, the prototypes, anything that we can just do physically works. Some very lo-fi prototypes before we commit to adding the art. And we've defined, I've just got 3 of them here, there's a few more, but we've defined some stages of done that help people when they're setting their goals for their Scrum. So the first stage is just a low fidelity prototype. Very functional, probably no art. It just plays and allows us to explore. And my best estimate is it's probably about 10%, if that, of the total cost. You can probably knock something like this up as a programmer in, a couple of days to a week. It's that kind of scale of thing. And then we have the next stage, which is to actually get something where it's not just a test of a little bit of a feature, but it's more fully formed, still with no art, but it does play like we're intending to for about another 20% of the cost. And we call that commit because by that stage, I think we've probably spent about 30% of what we're going to spend on it. And that's a pretty good time to stop and say, is it time to throw it away? Is it working? Do we want to do more prototyping, or do we want to proceed and spend a lot more money on this? And then the final stages are all about getting it fully functional and having all the art and audio put in. So I guess the point about that for me is, I'm not saying that's the right way to do things. We found it works for us, is that when we're having difficulty defining done, and when we can't get to a potentially shippable increment within a sprint or even within a release potentially, we found we've had to find a way of defining done at a more detailed level that people understand and have a common language for. The third point in there around how we work, and these things that just happen, is we talk all the time and say this phrase really, it's all about the software. Why aren't we looking at the software? The minute any conversation about our games goes on for longer than about 10 minutes in a room without looking at the software, somebody will usually pipe up, let's go and have a look at it, which I think is a fantastic place to be. And it's fundamental to the Agile Manifesto again. We value working software over I take that to mean lots of discussion and documentation. Of course, we need all that stuff, but it's really about the end product. And the measure of progress is in software, which I think is something we should really remember. So for us, that kind of means the continuous integration, which from the charts I saw, most people probably do. We have some fantastic tools that a couple of the guys have built on the team. And I think really mostly driven by that phrase of people will make important what you pay attention to. So by paying a lot of attention to the builds and wanting to see a version of our software every single morning, people get pretty sick of making a build manually pretty quickly. And without having to say to people, go and make us a great tool to do this, it kind of started to happen on the team. And we have some great tools that do that for us now, where people can just request a build at any time. Just works fantastically. And we do review them every day. And because of that, we also have I think this is true of a lot of the Scrum and Agile things, that things come out of the core principles, like fixing things when they break. Culture is just kind of what people do, because they know full well when they're in a room looking at the software and it doesn't work, then it's kind of the first thing they do is, I'll go and fix it. So things get fixed, which means the very end stage of our product, as is intended to be with Scrum and Agile, is reasonably smooth. We don't have a huge amount of bugs and faults building up towards the end of the project. The sprint reviews are software-led as well. So our sprint reviews tend to be in two parts. We look at the software, and then we look at the goals and the stories, and decide what's been kind of done and what isn't done, and we count up all the points and all that kind of story points, all that kind of stuff. And everything has to be in the build or in the software to count. And one of the programmers made that fantastic badge at the bottom there going, works on my machine, just as a kind of bit of a joke, because if anybody says it works on my machine in our teams, there's instant chorus of booing and heckling, because that's kind of forbidden inside the studio. We always say, well, we're not shipping your machine to the customers, are we? So make sure it's in the build. And this other really, really important point from Agile as well is that it's an empirical kind of approach that says we stop and we think about what we're doing at regular intervals all the time. I found many people who claimed this quote. I don't know whose it was, but I think that's pretty true, really. Just doing the same thing again and again and expecting things to get better is kind of pretty crazy, really. So I guess what we do, certainly what I try to do, is to be very active about encouraging people to talk, to have ideas, and to make it safe for people to say, I've got a problem with what we're doing. The minute that dissent is sort of squashed, and when people don't feel they can speak up, I think we have a really big problem. So we try to make improvement everybody's responsibility. We keep repeating the message. I'll talk about actively seeking feedback opportunities, take great lengths to try and find opportunities to talk to people. Telling stories, I find, is a great way. You know, sometimes at the company meeting, the team meeting on a Friday, I'll tell people about an email I had on Tuesday, which started my day badly, but was about somebody complaining that this process wasn't working well for us, and we sat down and talked about it, and we kind of figured things out. So telling stories, giving people examples as how they can go about this stuff. There's a certain amount of consequence to doing some of this stuff, though, and that's that if you're going to give people enough freedom to have responsibility for improving the process, there will be some degree of, I think, emergent behaviour, it's fair to say, on teams and across our studio. And also teams will sometimes not be all following the same process, because some of them will be experimenting with stuff. One of our teams recently has been experimenting with a slightly more Kanban kind of approach of a sort of more what they would call a sort of rolling Scrum. Other people experiment with different ways of estimating, and what usually happens is we let it run for a few weeks. If it's working, other teams tend to pick it up anyway because it's working well, and if it doesn't, it tends to die out. I think perhaps the most amazing example of emergent behaviour I've seen, which is really perhaps more along the topic of self-organising teams, was that we've recently been through a transition where we've finished one set of projects and we're moving on to another. And things are quite difficult at that time, because figuring out who's on what project can be quite tricky. And I was a little bit behind, I have to admit, with trying to figure out who was doing what. But what I found was people weren't just sitting there. I'd call a meeting for a particular project, and a load of people would come in that I had no idea they were working on that project, and people were just going to where they were needed, because they sort of felt that was the best thing to do, which I thought was really interesting. The other thing we do, I guess, is try and build these things into our process. So we have posters a bit like this, which we try and refer to during our sprint review. And we try and cover all those points, the usual things. What was the goal? What did we do? But what did we decide or learn along the way? And we try and get the whole team involved in at the sprint review to do a kind of mini retrospective, really. We actually wrap it into our sprint review. Probably not best practice, but we find that just is the quickest way to do that. Email. Obviously, we don't use a lot of email. That's a genuine example of somebody from a little while ago. It was quite a tough email, actually. It started off very nice, and then it got a bit worse, which I've cut off at the bottom. But it was really saying process is broken, what are we going to do to fix it? And it was just an excuse for me to sit down and have a good conversation about what was working. When we were small, when we was about 10 or 12 of us, we used to sit down at the end of our office every Friday and just have a chat about stuff. How was it going? How were things? And it's very hard to see this, I do understand that, but I made out of a fantastic bit of cardboard this set of dials, and we used that as the basis for our conversations. Nothing particularly scientific. We just had each of our projects up there. We had the process, we had the technology, various headings, and I just got people to say, you know, do you think, and we moved the dial as we talked. We just sort of hold it up and go, how do you think? Is this project going well, not going so well? And we just use that as a reason to get people talking about stuff and remind ourselves of what we needed to talk about. That's got increasingly difficult with a team now of 70 people. People don't really generally want to speak up in a bigger group. So something I started a year ago, which I've been quite pleased with, is to meet up with everybody in the studio on their annual anniversary. So I'm actually doing some 2-year ones at the moment now. And my theory was, if I meet up with everybody in the studio at least once a year properly for an hour, sit down and talk to them, every week I'll be seeing a couple of people roughly from the studio to talk about what's working and what's not. And it's proved really, really invaluable. It's not an appraisal, it's not anything to do with review, it's just me listening whilst they tell me about how things are, and I found that really totally invaluable. Other process experiments, I won't go into a lot of it. We've tried visual story cards, it's been quite interesting, just scribbling a little picture rather than writing lots of words. That works quite well for us. The other sort of little bit of experimentation that's stuck with us, actually, is the story cards. So we have a slightly different approach to some of this. This is a very, very early version from at least 2 years ago, where we tried to capture on a card the user story or the goal, the number of points, the story points, that's what the 5 is. And then something that I took from one of the other EA studios, actually, was this idea of tracking how confident we felt about delivery of this goal or this story within the current sprint. So those boxes represent 1 box per day for the sprint. And what the teams do is they, every morning, they talk about their work they're doing, what did you do yesterday, anything in the way, all that stuff. And the one addition we make is, at the end of that process, they colour in their box. If they're confident they're going to deliver still on the sprint, it goes green. Not so sure, a few problems, it's yellow, red, no chance. And that prompts the discussions amongst the team to say, well, there must be some problems in the way, what do we need to solve and to try and help you with. And it also keeps people focused on the goal, not just on the tasks. It's quite easy in the Scrum, I think, sometimes to just do all your tasks and lose sight of the story or the goal that you were trying to deliver. So that kind of forces everybody every day to think about the goal. And it became so embedded that about a year ago we started having these printed. They're slightly refined, but that's now what we do. We added in, you can't really read it probably, bottom left says stage, and that is the iteration stage that I described on the graph. So it means that people have a nice, concise way of saying, the story is to deliver this feature to this level of quality, a sketch or a prototype, with this many story points, and here's the progress kind of along the way. And these are used pretty religiously in the studio. So I think keeping us pretty much bang on time. There's my closing thoughts. This stuff just does take a lot of time and energy. If you're expecting to, I'm sure most of you know this already, just reading a textbook and hoping to implement a process kind of isn't how it works. It's hard work. You know, both you and the teams need a lot of enthusiasm to keep this going. I think you've probably seen the theme of what I've said here is, to me, the underlying principles of working software, face-to-face communication, trusting people to do their jobs, all this kind of stuff seem more valuable to me than the exact process that you follow. And I know several people in the Scrum community would probably shoot me for saying that, but that's kind of how I see things. Because then even if the process does start to fall apart, and it does fall apart, the principles keep things going. People understand what they do. And I think the observation for me is that culture, process, all those things, they kind of become one thing. Our culture is just what we do and how we do things, and it becomes so embedded that these things are kind of second nature without having to worry so much about the detail of the process. It does take time for some people to adapt, particularly people we hire that come from perhaps more traditional development environments. It's quite scary for people, the amount of responsibility particularly that they take on. Discussion with one of the guys we hired a year or two ago, and we were explaining kind of what went on, and he said, so what, it's my responsibility to figure out all this stuff, and you know, no one's going to tell me exactly what to do. And we were saying, that's right, and the penny kind of dropped, going, well, so that means I've got no one to blame if it's the wrong stuff or it all goes wrong. It's kind of my responsibility, and that's right. So we see it as positive. Some individuals can see that's quite threatening if they're used to having a manager to blame for everything when it goes wrong. Similar point here, I think, to the one that was in the survey, is that dealing with particularly external groups, in our case, that don't really understand Agile or Scrum is difficult. I spend a lot of my time translating kind of between our Scrum process and the more linear, milestone-driven process of our publishers. But I kind of accept that's just part of what I have to do. I try to educate them, but it is quite difficult. And there is some battle sometimes with some senior people. I still get it even with our small studio, who don't kind of understand all of it. So it takes a lot of talking still. The process evolves. Be prepared to let it evolve. But teams do start to own it. Surprising things happen. People enjoy their work. They're energetic, and they'll carry you through a lot of difficult times if that's how they feel that they're treated as well. So I think that's all I really have to say. I don't know if we've got 5 minutes if anybody wants to ask anything, or grab me afterwards over a coffee. Very happy to have a chat, and thank you very much again for inviting me to talk, and I hope that was interesting.
We maybe have time for a few questions. Any questions? Okay, I'll give you a microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Who am I looking at? Yeah. Yeah. People didn't hear that. The backlog is difficult for us. Have we thought about some kind of software tools? And I have actually used number of those tools, and I do find them really good. The difficulty for me is, so actually I do sometimes, I have resorted to a more electronic backlog that I kind of keep a little bit more perhaps behind the scenes, because I think it can be very useful, and certainly understanding the data and the velocity and doing the calculations is really fantastic. My biggest worry about it is that it starts to take away from some of those values in the team of talking to each other, standing up around a physical board and having a conversation, as opposed to at my desk looking at a software tool, figuring out what my next task is. So I've never quite reconciled that, and so I think they can be incredibly useful, and I think maybe we're lucky of the size that we are, we can just about manage. I think perhaps as we get a little bit bigger, I've certainly been thinking again to go and have a look at some of those ways of doing things.
You could imagine having a projection of some kind of
Yes. Yeah, that's something. I think if we can get to, I don't know, there are products that are starting to do that, quite well now. If we had a bit of budget, I think I'd certainly be looking at trying to do that. So I don't know if does anybody use sort of virtual post-it boards or boards, with which the team can get around? There's one over there. Okay. Cool. Okay.
Any question?
Oh, Xavier, there's one here.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you have several product owners, a group of product owners.
Yeah.
So sorry, I have a low voice. So you mentioned that you have groups of product owners. Yeah. So how do you manage priorities when different product owners have different priorities and different goals?
That's it is difficult. I mean, we try to do it as much by consensus as we possibly can. So when we talk about the product owners, I guess we have layers of product owners. Sort of right at the top of the chain, everybody has to serve somebody, and for us, our publisher, Sony, generally the people that are directing the games we're making towards the right market and something they believe that they can sell. So I suppose, in some sense, they're the ultimate product owner to make sure that this is something they feel they can make some money out of and that we're getting the business value. So that's kind of how that kind of works. But what they certainly don't do is generally talk about all the detail that goes sort of below that. So kind of next step down is our sort of senior studio exec team, who generally are that interface with the publisher and define the things that are important for this particular product. And then day to day, usually the senior team on the project team as a group will take that and work with the team to prioritize the work that needs to get done. So when there are conflicts, usually somebody makes a call. Ultimately, if the Sony producer comes back to us and says, I tell you what, this has to be done, we might argue it for a while, but ultimately we'll do that. And usually, eventually, I guess, if we had a real problem with that, which happens very rarely inside the studio, it would kind of defer to the most senior person in the studio, to our MD or to me usually, to make that call. But very rarely do we have to do that. It's very interesting. Usually we get to agreement by discussion.
Thanks.
Bon, d'autres questions?
Yes. If your backlog is purely physical, what kind of agreement have you with your publisher?
We've for some of the stuff on the boards, we've actually started to literally send them photographs of boards. So that's some stuff that we do. But I don't think that's really your question. I think the question in terms of the agreement we have is a lot more linear, and it is monthly milestone driven. That's how our agreement is with our publisher. That's how it works. So, but what I've tried to educate them to, and I think we've kind of got to a place that says, whatever project management methodology you use, you can plan for the whole project at a pretty high level. This is kind of backlog, really. You can plan for the next month in quite a lot of detail. So we've kind of got to the stage with them where they're happier to have milestone definitions further out that are a bit looser, and that we then define just when we start doing that milestone. And we treat that really like a release. It's kind of release planning for Scrum for us. That's kind of the link, I think. We'll run roughly 2 sprints to meet one milestone, which is a release with some software at a particular stage. And then we'll review where we are, re-agree the milestone definition for the next month, and then move on. So it is tricky, though, because contractually they like to have everything nailed down. I just ignore them, actually. Oh, sorry. That's kind of often is true, though, is we just do the work we think is the right work. And so can take responsibility. I don't know if that answered the question. Maybe we talk later. It's a good question. Yes.
Yes, hi. In an organization like yours, people decide almost everything, I guess. Do you go up to letting them decide of their paycheck?
Do we let people decide their paycheck? No, not quite. It probably sounds, I think at the project level, we try to have it as self-organizing as we possibly can. And actually, interesting question, we do things like annual reviews, bonuses, pay, in a very different way to a lot of companies I've worked in before. There's a lot of trust there that we'll do that well. It's probably a longer conversation. But no, ultimately there are still decision makers and managers there somewhere. We just try and keep it all out of the way of people, I think. Not make it be the big focus. And I think we've all seen, we probably now, maybe people see it now, this horrible annual process where everybody's fighting for a pay increase, for a bonus, or for a bit of the bonus. And if you want to talk to me about how we've dealt with that, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But no, they don't decide, sorry.
So thank you again, Harvey. It was very great, interesting.